New support for an unloved archetype.
Next on Eternal Turtles.
Stop! I need more stuff. Can you see I need more stuff? Let's have a go.
Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. If you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurtles. In return, you'll get ad-free content and a bonus episode every single week. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, tell me about this new card that is a 1-mana artifact that can draw a card that we finally got, Zach. Tell me about it. You told me a 1-mana artifact that draws a card?
Answers are prayered, as they say. So I one of the things when I was playing Death Shadow, and obviously we're talking about the card Last Ride, but one of the things that I sort of noticed when we were playing Death Shadow is for the advantage of having a 1-mana, 12/12 or whatever, you give up a lot by sacrificing most of your life total, right? And just for Death Shadow isn't enough payoff for that, at least not in the way that the current legacy metagame. It's a great beater, but the shell was just better as a reanimator shell, honestly. Like once people figured out okay, grief and stuff like that, okay, well, why not just throw in, let's take out the water graves and just become a reanimator shell, right? People figured that out, and a genesis of that and Blue Black Delver sort of created the current legacy reanimator. And a lot of that was because Death Shadow just wasn't enough payoff to lose almost all of your life in order to get a big creature into play that was pretty much just a vanilla creature, right? And I had limited success with that, playing it with Green Splash for Berserk and stuff like that at a time when Elves was a playable deck, and Elves was a classic foil to Rug Delver. So switching up to a version of basically what is Rug Delver, but instead of Tarmogoyf, I was playing Death Shadow, and using Berserk to just push through the rest of my damage or have an OTK in one turn. The deck was working pretty well. I played it at an SCG event. I went 4-3 as I was kind of putting the deck together, trying to figure out how it went. And then later in the tournament, as is the case with me oftentimes, later in the tournament, I started figuring out the deck, and I really got good at piloting it to the point where I was able to beat Burn, which is a weird matchup for that deck. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel. But let's talk about the Last Ride. The Last Ride is a legendary artifact for 1 black mana that is a vehicle. It's a 13/13 vehicle, but just like Death Shadow, it says Last Ride gets -X, where X is your life total. And then it has Crew 2, and here's the big part. For 3 mana, that's 2 and a black, you can pay 2 life and draw a card. These two particular things, another payoff for Death Shadow and enabler for Death Shadow, is what we've been looking for that deck for a while. And now, is this going to be a tier 1 deck? I don't think so, but it does give you a chance to be hey, as a budget intro to getting into Legacy, this is a perfect chance to be okay, I'm going to play Death Shadow while I start and figure out, if I want to play Delver or if I want to, go down Reanimator or whatnot. This gives you a chance to sort of get into the groove of playing Brainstorm, Ponder, Daze, Wasteland style decks. And the deck isn't actually that expensive. I have the workings of a deck right now, and it's a tier deck, I would say tier C, 3-tier deck. But occasionally you just get in wins, especially if you're at your local and you're playing against decks that aren't punishing your life total that much. Decks like Self-Led Breakfast is a classic example. If that deck just is trying to go for the combo, or Doomsday, you can leverage the fact that your opponent isn't really worried about your life total and go with this card. So, Phil, let's talk a little bit more about Last Ride.
The thing that jumped out to me, of course, it is a callback to Death Shadow, right? It's the effect, right, and the stats. It's exactly Death Shadow. So they knew exactly that this was going to be Death Shadow's X, 5 through whatever. the trick there are two interesting caveats that I think are interesting here. The first is that it's legendary, so you can't have more than one of these guys on the field. So like in a way, that sort of is the I feel like the problem that Death Shadow always had was against white decks that had Swords to Plowshares, and then after that Prismatic Ending.
Yeah.
Swords to Plowshares was Prismatic Ending not nearly as bad as Swords to Plowshares for that deck, because if they Swords to Plowshares, it means that you have to reset your life total down below, because hitting a Death Shadow always put it back to 13, how the math always works out.
Yeah.
Prismatic Ending, at least your life total would stay the same, so you could deploy another one. And then at the time when pour one out from my boy Terminus. When Terminus was around, it was hard to overextend into like multiple shadows onto the board. And with Swords to Plowshares, you also couldn't extend multiple shadows onto the board because one sword would take out both.
Yeah.
With this
Not
one,
to mention Solitude too.
Right, and Solitude, which still sees play in the Yorion D&T decks.
Yeah.
But what's nice about Last Ride is because Last Ride is a vehicle, you can deploy it and a Death Shadow at the same time. And if the Death Shadow gets hit by something, the Last Ride stays because it's not a creature.
Yeah.
So it is sort of insulated against that, and so you can set up a position where you could, if you know you're going to fight that war, you actually can extend onto the board in such a way where Swords to Plowshares is a little bit contended with. The other side of it is, I don't know about how your experience is when you play Death Shadow, Zach, because I know that our play styles are always different. But I find that in the times that I have played Death Shadow, I do have a set of Altered Death Shadow, by the way. You're welcome to rock with them anytime you want. But it's also from like modern, however many years ago, like well before Modern Horizons 3, like Powercraft. But what I also found with Death Shadow is you really were in the space of like, if you weren't playing like Night's Whisper or splashing for like Painful Truths or something, like you ran out of gas really fast because all the beaters that you played never really converted advantage. This was back during the time when like Death Shadow also played like Gurmag Angler. And so you were playing like these thick beaters, but like you could lean into Tassiger if you wanted to a mana sink to try and recoup some cards, but that was expensive. That was 4 mana. That was really deep. Where like I think Last Ride's like the biggest boon for a deck like Death Shadow is against the decks that are giving you life back with Swords to Plowshares. This funnels as a way to sink your mana to convert that into card advantage. So you actually can grind and go long. I think the biggest draw to me was it's finally that deck has a mana sink in a way where like the other Delver decks or Delver style decks, like, you know, it made sense to just be Reanimator better. But like if you were playing Delver and you were playing Bolt or playing any kind of burn, well, you never really needed to recoup the cards because you were trying to get across the finish line by just burning them out. So you had reach, where Death Shadow never really had reach. So it was like a player could go down to however much they needed to and know that they were going to be relatively safe. And then likewise, if you were playing now against Blue-Eye Delver, it's like, well, they may not have a mana sink the way that we know it, but Dragon Rage Channeler, if you think about like how many cards it can surveil over time to improve the card quality, like within the confines of how long they want the game to last, like if it mills 2 cards, 3 cards, 4 cards that a player like actively didn't want, like if it hits a land in a time where like, you know, a land is just a dead draw, like that is effectively as good as drawing a card for what they're trying to do in terms of like, you know, for the velocity that we're talking about. So I think the Last Ride's mana sink ability is actually the best part of the card, even though it isn't going to come up. I think it's the part of the card that shores up that deck's weaknesses.
Yeah, I agree. I think you hit the nail on the head with the Swords of Plowshare situation, right? You generally never really want to against a deck that is playing Swords of Plowshares. You almost never want 2 Death Shadow in play at the same time. Mostly because like you're just gonna get blown out. You know, like 1 Swords just is a 2-for-1 against your entire deck. Not to mention, you know, other things that you're trying to get to happen. It basically just makes you use resources poorly to try and get back to the lower life total that you need. But with this, you know, you're able to basically just say, oh, thanks for the extra life. You know, if the game is going long, which a Swords to Plowshares deck is probably going to want the game to go, you know, longer, you know, then you can start using it to recoup the advantage. And that's actually, you know, like you said, that's actually one of the bigger points of this card. Not to mention the fact that like, yeah, it is a payoff for going low in life total. You're never going to have, you really shouldn't, I should say, have a situation where you are crewing this when you already have a Death Shadow out, right? Like, you generally are just playing the Protect the Queen strategy, you know, like a Delver deck with this deck. So if you're in a situation where you hopefully you're winning the game if you're crewing it and attacking with a Death Shadow, but you rarely want to be in a situation where both these things are on the board and you're attacking into like open white mana, right? Or, you know, 2 cards in your opponent's hand if they're playing Solitude, you know. But this card allows you to now you have to think about what creatures you want in your deck to crew this card, right? So you know, obviously there are some creatures that work, there's some creatures that don't work. Baleful Strix immediately seems like a card that's like just not there, you know, like the death touch and the draw card, wonderful, but the fact that it's like you need 2 of these into play to even get it going, chances are any other creature in your deck is going to crew it by itself. So I don't think, even though I would like to up the blue count in this deck just a little bit for Force of Will and maybe Force of Negation, I don't think that what's called Baleful Strix is really where you want to be. So then you've got you know, you've got choices like I think Netherglyph is a way to go, because Netherglyph is almost always going to be a 2x, you know, at least. It obviously Orcish Bowmasters puts 2 bodies worth of 2 power into play just by itself. So even if your opponent tries to remove it, you know, they're like, oh, I'll brainstorm. You're like, I'm an Orcish Bowmaster. They're like, okay, in response to Orcish Bowmaster hitting play with the thing on stack, I'm gonna, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and kill it. You can, assuming you have the token, you can crew the uh, crew the last ride. So there's that. Hey, Legacy fans, since you're enjoying the show, please like and subscribe to the video. It helps the channel grow.
Support Eternal Turtles on Patreon so we can create even more content and cover events.
Patreons get an ad-free RSS feed, 4 bonus episodes a month, and Discord recognition. Join the Dirtle Maniacs at patreon.com/eternaldurtles.
Now back to the show.
Then beyond that, I mean, you know, you have a Boron Oculus is a card that I've seen people look at and play, and I'm not sure if that's really where you want to be. And also, obviously, it has a little bit of an issue with Netherglyph, but you know, it does accrue 2/2s. You know, Manifest Dread. Here's another 2/2, which is pretty good. And then beyond that, like you got Stalactite Stalker, obviously that works well with it. Obviously, you never want to use a Death Shadow to crew this thing because it's the same. You know, you're just putting more. It's that much more likely that you're going to end up having to lose 2 creatures. But yeah, I think this is good. Good in a very particular meta. I think if you're the type of person who likes to play Death Shadow, this is definitely a card worth looking at and being like, okay, like maybe we should, you know, maybe we should look at this deck again and see what we can get out of it. Sauron's Ransom is still a card that I thought was really underplayed in the last metagame, and I think could use a look. Phil, another question I wanted to, you know, because we were having these theory crafting episodes about control, is can you, because like Death Shadow is a card that like you don't play on turn 1, you don't play on turn 2, you know, and it is under 2 mana. Could you see like a blue-black version of control, you know, using Death Shadow and Last Ride, like maybe using that to accrue advantage in a situation where like you're like your opponent's working on your game plan?
I think that it's like the difficult thing about the Death Shadow shell or the Death Shadow style cards is like the only way that I think this would make that you could look at Last Ride as a card that you'd play in a control shell is if the other creatures that you have, let's say you have your Orcish Bowmasters or your Snapcasters or whatever that you're playing, that could incidentally crew the thing. But I don't think you can look at it as like, oh, this is a win condition. I think if you were looking at this in a control shell outside of a Days Wasteland shell, you're looking at Last Ride as it is a 1-mana artifact that then has the draw activated ability on it.
Yeah.
That type of card has never been playable in a Legacy shell where in a format as fast as this is. Now, if the trade-off is you get a bunch of cards that I think the trade-off that you would need to have in a given format for something like that to actually be worth the time to test it is if you were already in the market for other cards that incidentally clipped your life total. For example, if you were like, well, you know, I'm playing Swords to Plowshares or I'm playing whatever, or white is just bad outside of Swords to Plowshares, like there's no draw and it's, you know, I have no reason to play white otherwise. If you're like, okay, I don't want to play white, and you're like, you know what is just as good as Swords to Plowshares in this format where Merit Lage doesn't exist? Snuff Out. Like if you were in the market where you were like, you know what, Snuff Out is actually just crazy in this meta. I want to max out on Snuff Out. How can I actually take advantage of that in a way that, you know, is not just conceding a bunch of games to Lightning Bolt? Then I think you could look at this card. I think the other avenue, less so control, but the other side of things that we haven't talked about is there used to be in old Death Shadow decks that were trying out things around blue. Have you seen like the Dragon Rage Channeler 8 bauble type shell that just, you know, plays Dragon Rage Channeler a bunch of baubles and wants to like go off and then like, you know, put Gurmags into play as fast as possible, that type of thing? The other aspect of this that we haven't talked about, and there's another card that might make sense here as a way to, you know, bridge the gap between your two loves, Zach. I'm going to look it up because it's also in the spoilers here. It's Demonic Junker, which is 6 and a black. It's an artifact vehicle. It has affinity for artifacts, so you can cast it for 1 black if you have 6 artifacts. And it says when it enters, for each player, destroy up to 1 target artifact. Destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. If a creature you controlled was destroyed this way, put 2 +1/+1 counters on this vehicle. Now, for each player, destroy up to 1 target. So that means that like you can destroy something of your opponent's and choose not to destroy something for you because it's up to. Of course. Now, so this is just a one. Look, if you have enough artifacts in your deck, this is just 1 mana, kill their thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there maybe is between that card being an artifact and Last Ride being an artifact. There might be some crossover for Death Shadow 8 cast.
8 death.
8 death. Now, I say that because now you have a Death Shadow that like Emery can recur.
Yeah.
And that's not nothing.
That could like could it kill itself? Assuming it was crude?
What?
The artifact that you're just talking about.
When this vehicle enters, for each player, destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. If a creature you control is destroyed this way, put 2 +1/+1 counters on this vehicle. So is a triggered ability?
If you had those, you know, the resources on board, you could crew it, kill itself, get it back with Emery, and just keep it going because it basically is its own sack outlet.
So trigger on the stack if you have a creature with 2, if you have 2 power on the board to be able to crew this thing. Yeah, trigger on the stack, you can crew it, and so it can target itself, and so it can go down. Now, how does that work with your blue count? How does with all the artifacts and such? But I think that these 2 like artifacts create like a really interesting area where it's like, are there other artifacts that can deplete your life total instead of like the normal shock mana base that we're used to? I don't know. I think that, but when you brought up Last Ride as like, oh yeah, that's Death Shadow, and then I was like, I don't know. It's a mana sink, and also it's an artifact, and like Emery likes artifacts. Urza Saga likes artifacts. Like
my biggest issue here, and look, it's enticing because Ancient Tomb in a Death Shadow deck is like,
right? See, like, okay, yeah. Now we're getting spicy.
We're looking at a 1 black mana artifact that isn't castable off of an Ancient Tomb, right? So there's obviously some play that would have to happen to the mana base there. Mox Opal allows this to be even a possibility of a deck idea. I'd be interested to see what we could put together with a deck like this because there's certainly something there. I don't know that I think that if we're in a situation where 8 cast is barely playable right now, this is a little pie in the sky, but it is an interesting like theory craft idea because the value of just being able to abyss your opponent every single turn, not to mention draw extra cards with Emery, 8 just doing the regular 8 cast stuff. If there was a way to also like thought seize your opponent with an artifact, like that would be pretty enticing to me.
So now, if you're like, okay, I don't know if the mana is going to work out. I mean, maybe a place to actually start is just, okay, what is the baseline affinity shell for 8 cast, which is the baubles, the opals, the lotus petals.
Yeah.
So you have all of the zeros. It's like that plus Last Ride. Well, all of those, that's what, 16 0-mana artifacts. And then Last Ride is a 1-mana artifact. And then whatever Urza Saga, tech pieces are, whether that's Lava Spur Boots, Shadow Spear, Soul Guide Lantern, whatever your tech of choice to pull out from there is.
I mean,
Okay,
the
so we're
answer
at
is now
some
Spellbomb as far as Soul Guide Lantern is
Nile
concerned if you're playing
Spellbomb.
black,
Yeah,
right?
sure, exactly. But that's what I mean. Okay, so now we have approximately 20 artifacts, 22, 24 artifacts in our deck. Before we even get into the Death Shadow side of things. And if we're already in Ancient Tomb, that's attacking our life total. And then instead of blue for Force of Will and the card draw, well, the card draw is going to be helped out by Last Ride. That there's one aspect where like you do have some element of just like being able to sync there. You have removal, which in ways that 8-cast didn't have before. If they needed to fight over something, they would have to fight over it on a stack. So between Demonic Junker and then your other pieces of disruption could be something like Thoughtseize, as other things that Death Shadow wants. Like these are more Death Shadowy tools. But I don't see why you couldn't move into just being essentially black 8-cast. So instead of having the 8-cast cards, you have 8 vehicles. Plus your Death Shadows, and now you may not have the recursion type effects, but you do have all of the powerful delve type stuff or affinity type stuff that would still want these
Just
shells.
go mono black, huh?
We also have there's also there is the black. I know that there's the type of cards where it's like sacrifice a creature, like the pauper, deadly dispute. That can you sack a thing, draw cards, and make treasures. Like there's value in that if you wanted a way to cycle through some stuff for card draw instead of the actual thought cast. So you have all those cards that are powerful and incidentally typically good in shells that are playing these many zeros in their deck. But then alternatively, there's the Blood Artist style effects. I know that Disciple of the Vault hasn't seen play in a long time, but if we're playing all the baubles plus Mox Opal to Legend Rule itself plus Deadly Dispute in some way on top of all that, okay, now we're churning a little bit. But I think there's also the Blood Artist type effect where it's it's a one in a black that whenever an artifact goes, so there might be some density here that if you can churn enough, that Last Ride ties the room together by being a mana sink that can just upload on the cards in addition. And then I don't know, are there any other black cards that just work with artifacts in a way that we've never been incentivized to before? Now that these two vehicles incentivize enough that Ancient Tomb isn't a deficit now. It is not only ramping our mana, but it is also the thing that is fueling the Last Ride.
Yeah, that's interesting because pay 4 life, draw a card. Not exactly where you want to be, assuming you're activating this.
But it's pay 4 life, draw a card with the impending threat. Right?
Exactly. With the impending threat. That's interesting. It's food for thought because the way my head was going was what other color do I want to splash? Do I want to go green for the Berserk Reach? Do I want to go red so that I can play Dragon's Rage Chandler and lightning bolts and stuff like that and go more to the face? Or do I just want to stick to blue black? But now this is enticing to think about it as okay, maybe I want to try artifacts and just go with a black 8-cast style deck. Is an interesting thought experiment. I haven't obviously haven't put much thought into it yet, but there's stuff that we could mess around with. I mean, look at Tony Scapone's Black Saga Storm to try and get some ideas. But getting to the point where you're low-ish on life total, and obviously you don't want to play Shadow Spear in this deck because that's going to be a problem. But Lava Spur Boots is this is a particular scenario where Lava Spur Boots is a great tool. That's an interesting take. I haven't really I need to take more time to put this in. I'm going to add a couple of deck lists to our to the Eternal Dirtles what's it called Moxfield. So stick to that, look at that, subscribe to the Moxfield or whatever, follow us on Moxfield. Follow each of us individually on Moxfield too. All the links are below for that. And I'll come up with a couple ideas because this is interesting design space, and I hadn't even thought about that just yet. So kudos to you for that, Phil.
I think it's just if you think about what these shells of a deck are, Like, there just has never really been a reason. Like, maybe you could argue if you were on like the Gav Blast style like burn decks and you just wanted to be an artifact-based burn deck, like maybe there was a reason to go into that, but then you didn't really have much interaction if they were playing on the stack. So it's like 8-cast was always just the space to go. And also because, a bauble with an Emery on turn 1 is just build your own Library of Alexandria. That's really powerful. But the difference that like blue always had was blue had Emery and Psy as like ways to recoup cards plus the 8-cast cards to like go up on volume, so like you were paid off for doing that type of thing. But like I think that if there is a reason to go into black, and I think that that's where I was saying that the most interesting part of Last Ride to me isn't the impending threat. Like, yes, that's cool, and yes, that is the ultimate payoff to like be able to afford all of the other slots in a deck. But I think that like between Ancient Tomb and all the fast mana, like you can deploy a turn 1 Last Ride, and then theoretically you could be sinking mana into it for the next couple of turns if you're on a deck that isn't pressuring if that's what the game is about, to just draw cards that way, as opposed to overextending or doing whatever. Because in a way, you would kind of have to do that for your 8-cast effects anyway.
Yeah.
If you were thought monitoring, you would sort of be doing that stuff anyway. But like the difference between what black could do versus what blue could do is if you're playing Demonic Junker, well, now you also have removal in your deck. So if your opponent actually deploys something, you don't have to overload on your side to overwhelm that, right? Like if your opponent played creatures and you couldn't really remove them effectively outside of something like Dismember or whatever, Dismember also a great tool to get your life total down, by the way.
Yeah.
That like you would ultimately have to like overwhelm the opposing board with artifacts between Psy and Urza Saga. And I think that like you just don't have to do that if you actually have tools to interact beyond counter magic. And so, essentially a black 8-cast becomes really enticing when you have artifacts that are worth putting the bauble, opal, petal, shell with, because those 16 0-mana artifacts, that itself is a known viable shell if the payoffs around it are good enough. And so far, only the affinity spells have been good enough. But I mean, if you look at the 2 new vehicles that we're getting here, those are good enough. Now, there is something to be said that those are 2 vehicles, and is there vehicle payoffs? If there are additional vehicles, I mean, I know that people play Unlicensed Hearse. That's a very good vehicle. There's Mech Hangar or whatever. That's 3 mana crew and artifact, or crew of a vehicle for 4 mana. It's just 3 tap on Mech Hangar. And there's also Consulate Dreadnought, which is a 1 mana like 7/11 vehicle. So that you can fetch off of your Urza Saga. So like, maybe Mech Hangar is the other tech land that you get to play alongside your monocolored artifact deck. And so you can just arbitrarily crew these large artifacts whenever you want. Like there is space when you aren't playing a fetch dual mana base to really explore in these techie sort of spaces. And I think that like when you were like, Last Ride for Death Shadow, I'm like, Last Ride has a lot of depth to open up a lot of space because it has a lot of attributes that just black just hasn't really had access to in a meaningful way for the stuff that is competitively viable in Legacy. And now the Vexing Bubble is gone, like 8-cast is back on the menu, or the 8-cast shell is back on the menu,
Yeah. All right. Well, let's call it there. I'm gonna go ahead and build some decks. Comment below if you have any ideas for these 2 cards, Last Ride or Demonic Junker. These are the 2 cards that so far have been the most interesting out of Aetherdrift. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you later. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button. It grows the legacy content ecosystem we all love by relaying to the platform that you are part of our passionate community.
And to go even further, click the links for subscription or to support directly via Patreon to help us create more content for you. Patreon supporters get 4 exclusive extra episodes per month. If you're listening on an audio platform, head over to patreon.com/eternaldurdles.
Thanks so much for your support.
We'll see you in the next one.